Two small German Shepherd puppies sat quietly on a weathered wooden porch, their fur dusty from the road and their paws worn from a journey no one had witnessed. They weren't barking. They weren't begging for food. They were simply waiting. Inside the house lived a retired Navy SEAL, a man who had spent years learning how to live with loss, and even longer learning how to live alone. When he opened the door that autumn morning, he thought he was looking at two abandoned puppies in need of help. But why had they come to his house? How far had they traveled? And why did they seem so certain they had finally found the person they were searching for? Some journeys begin with a rescue. Others begin with a question. This is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. Early autumn had settled gently over the small mountain town of Livingston, Montana. The air carried the faint scent of dry pine needles and fallen leaves, and the distant hills glowed beneath a pale golden sky. It was the kind of season that made some people feel grateful for what they still had. For others, it only reminded them of what was gone. Walter Grayson stood alone in his kitchen, staring at a cardboard box sitting on the dining table. The box contained 38 years of marriage. At least, that was how it felt. A few photographs, a collection of handwritten anniversary cards, a silver bracelet, several old receipts that should have been meaningless but somehow weren't. Walter picked up one photograph and looked at it for a long moment before placing it back inside. At 72 years old, Walter was still a physically imposing man, despite his age. He stood over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and weathered features shaped by decades of military service and Montana winters. Thick silver hair remained neatly trimmed above thoughtful gray eyes. A short gray beard framed his face, making him appear stern from a distance, though people who truly knew him once described him as patient and dependable. Once, before life changed him. Walter had spent most of his adult life serving as a Navy SEAL. Years of dangerous missions had taught him discipline, endurance, and how to survive almost anything. Almost. The one thing he never learned how to survive was loneliness. 3 years earlier, cancer had taken his wife, Eleanor. The loss had not happened all at once. That was the cruel part. It happened slowly. One appointment, one treatment, one hospital room, one goodbye at a time. Since then, Walter's world had grown smaller with every passing season. Now he was preparing to sell the house they had shared for nearly 30 years. The last house he would ever own. The thought should have felt practical. Instead, it felt like surrender. Walter sealed the cardboard box with tape and carried it toward the hallway closet. That was when he heard something outside, a faint, scratching sound. He frowned. The sound came again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. At first he assumed it was a branch brushing against the porch, but the old oak tree stood too far away. Walter walked toward the front door. The sound stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then he opened the door and froze. 2 German Shepherd puppies sat directly on the wooden porch. Neither moved, neither barked, neither seemed frightened. The puppies appeared to be roughly 4 months old. Their black and tan fur was dirty and tangled with burrs and dried grass. Dust coated their paws. One puppy had a small tear along the edge of an ear. The other was thinner than it should have been, its ribs faintly visible beneath the fur. They looked exhausted, as if they had traveled much farther than any puppy should. Walter stared. The puppies stared back. "Well," Walter muttered, "you're a long way from home." Still, neither animal moved. The thinner puppy slowly sat down. The other tilted its head, waiting. Not begging. Waiting. Something about that bothered him. Lost animals usually behaved differently. Fear, Excitement? Panic? Confusion? These two seemed strangely calm, purposeful. Walter crouched carefully. The puppies remained still. No growling, no hesitation, no fear. That's unusual. Years around military working dogs had taught Walter how animals behaved. These two were not acting like strays. Eventually, he sighed. "Fine, come inside." Both puppies immediately stood, not because they were excited, almost as if they had expected him to say that. Walter shook his head. "Now that's just strange." Inside the house, the puppies drank water so quickly he had to refill the bowl twice. They devoured every scrap of food he placed in front of them. Yet even after eating, they never fully relaxed. Instead, they wandered from window to window, looking, searching, watching. Walter noticed something else. Whenever they reached the north-facing windows, they stopped, every time. The mountains stretched across the northern horizon beyond town. The puppies would stand there for several seconds before moving on. The behavior repeated throughout the afternoon. Walter found himself watching them more than television. By evening, he realized he had smiled several times. That surprised him. He couldn't remember the last time anything in the house had made him smile. As sunset faded beyond the mountains, Walter settled into his recliner. One puppy slept near the fireplace. The other remained beside the window, still facing north. The house phone rang. Walter immediately knew who it was. The caller ID confirmed it. Sarah Grayson, his daughter. Walter stared at the screen. Sarah was 44 years old, with dark chestnut hair and intelligent brown eyes inherited from her mother. She worked as a school counselor in Spokane. Kind-hearted and stubborn in equal measure, Sarah had spent years trying to maintain a relationship with her father. Years of unanswered calls, years of awkward conversations, years of emotional distance. Not because she didn't care, because Walter didn't know how to let people close anymore. The phone continued ringing. Walter watched it. Then he looked away. The call went to voicemail. A familiar knot formed inside his chest. Guilt. Regret. And the exhausting knowledge that fixing some things seemed harder than breaking them. The puppies watched him quietly, as though they had witnessed the entire exchange. "Don't start judging me," Walter muttered. One puppy yawned. The other simply stared. For the first time in months, the silence inside the house felt different. Not empty, just quiet. Later that night, Walter prepared a blanket near the fireplace for the puppies. He expected them to sleep there. Instead, he woke several hours later and found both puppies standing near the front window again, looking toward the dark mountains. Waiting. For what? For whom? Walter didn't know. He approached them carefully. One puppy finally lowered its head. As it did, something caught Walter's attention. A worn leather collar hidden beneath the fur. He knelt. The collar looked old, much older than the puppy. Walter gently turned the metal tag. The engraving had faded with time. For a moment, he could barely read it. Then the letters became clear. Daisy. Walter's heartbeat stopped. Not literally, but close enough. The room suddenly felt very small. Because Daisy was not just a name. 5 years earlier, during a brutal winter storm high in the Montana mountains, Walter had rescued a German shepherd that carried that exact name. And until this moment, he had not thought about her in years. The following morning arrived beneath a pale Montana sky washed in soft silver clouds. A cool breeze drifted through the valley, carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. Walter Grayson stood at the kitchen window with a cup of black coffee cooling in his hands, while the 2 German shepherd puppies sat near the north-facing glass. They had barely touched the blankets he had prepared for them. Instead, they had spent much of the night watching the mountains. The collar tag still rested in Walter's palm. Daisy. Even after sleeping on it, the name felt impossible. For several minutes, he simply stood there, staring at the worn metal tag. Memory was a strange thing. Some moments disappeared forever. Others waited quietly for years before returning all at once. 5 years earlier, during one of the worst snowstorms Montana had seen in decades, Walter had been driving home through the mountains after attending a veterans support meeting. Back then, Eleanor was still alive, but already battling cancer. Every trip away from home felt heavy. Every conversation with doctors felt heavier. He remembered the snow first, not falling, attacking. The wind had driven white sheets across the road until visibility nearly disappeared. Even Walter, who had spent years operating in hostile environments, had considered turning back. Then he had seen movement near a ditch, a shape, struggling against the storm. At first, he assumed it was a deer. Then the headlights revealed a German shepherd. The dog had been large and heavily pregnant, with thick black and tan fur buried beneath snow and ice. One rear leg was injured. She could barely stand. Yet even then, she had tried to protect herself when Walter approached. He remembered kneeling in the snow, remembered speaking softly, remembered the fear in her eyes. Not aggression, fear. The kind that comes from being abandoned too many times. Walter had carried her into his truck. He still remembered how little she weighed for a dog her size. At home, Eleanor had immediately fallen in love with her. Walter smiled faintly at the memory. Eleanor Grayson had been a small woman with silver blonde hair, kind blue eyes, and a warmth that seemed capable of filling any room. Even during her illness, she had found ways to care for others before herself. That habit had frustrated doctors and inspired nearly everyone who knew her. "You brought home another project," Eleanor had teased when she first saw the dog. "She's not a project." "That's exactly what you said about the injured horse." Walter chuckled softly. The puppies looked up at him. For a brief moment, the house felt less empty. Over the following weeks, Daisy had slowly recovered. Her leg healed, her strength returned. She followed Eleanor everywhere. During chemotherapy days, Daisy would curl beside her chair for hours without moving. Animals noticed things people often missed. Walter had always believed that. Daisy seemed to understand Eleanor's pain without anyone explaining it. Then, one morning, shortly after Eleanor's condition worsened, Daisy disappeared. No broken fence, no signs of struggle. She simply left. Walter had searched for days. Nothing. Eventually, life pulled him in other directions. Hospital visits, medical decisions, funeral arrangements, grief. The years passed. Now the name had returned unexpectedly through 2 exhausted puppies sitting in his kitchen. The thinner puppy suddenly stood and walked toward the door. The second followed. Walter watched them. They stopped, looked at him, then looked toward the mountains again. "You're making this difficult," he muttered. The thinner puppy whined softly, not for food, not for attention, for something else, something Walter couldn't quite understand. A knock interrupted his thoughts. The front door opened before he could answer. Only one person in town would do that. Martha Reynolds stepped inside, carrying a pie dish covered with foil. Martha was 76 years old, short and sturdy, with curly white hair that refused to obey gravity, and bright green eyes that seemed permanently amused by the world. She had lived next door for 20 years and considered privacy a flexible concept. "Oh, good," Martha said. "You're alive?" Walter sighed. "Good morning to you, too." Martha placed the pie on the counter. Then she noticed the puppies. "Oh, my." The puppies immediately approached her. Martha crouched with surprising ease. "Well, aren't you 2 handsome travelers?" Walter raised an eyebrow. "Travelers? Look at them." "What about them?" "They don't look lost." Walter glanced at the dogs. That was exactly what had been bothering him. Lost animals wandered. These puppies seemed to have a destination. Martha studied Walter carefully. Then she smiled, the kind of smile older people develop after decades of reading faces. "You look different." Walter frowned. "I do not?" "You do." "No." "You smiled." Walter looked offended. "I did not." Martha laughed. The puppies wagged their tails. For a moment, the kitchen felt almost normal. After Martha left, Walter spent the afternoon attempting to distract himself. He repaired a loose cabinet hinge, sorted old paperwork, cleaned the garage. None of it worked. Every time he looked outside, the puppies were facing north, waiting. By evening, Walter finally admitted something he had resisted all day. Curiosity was winning. Not because he believed in destiny, not because he believed animals carried messages, because human beings need answers. Especially when life gives them questions at exactly the wrong moment. As darkness settled across the valley, the puppies became restless, more restless than before. They paced near the door, whined softly, returned to the windows, then back to the door again. Finally, the thinner puppy grabbed the edge of Walter's jacket hanging near the entrance and tugged. Walter stared. The puppy tugged again. The second joined in. "Seriously?" Both puppies looked at him. Walter shook his head. Then something unexpected happened. The first puppy walked to the driveway, stopped, turned around, waited. The second copied the behavior. Walter felt a strange chill. Not fear, recognition. The puppies were not running away. They were asking him to follow. The realization settled heavily inside his chest. For the first time in years, something outside his routine was pulling him forward instead of pushing him back. Walter looked toward the distant mountains, then toward the empty house behind him. One direction led toward familiar loneliness. The other led toward questions. Slowly, Walter reached for his coat. The puppies immediately stood, ready, waiting. Walter looked at them for several seconds. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's find out where you're trying to go." A soft layer of morning fog rested over the Montana countryside as Walter Grayson steered his aging pickup truck onto a narrow county road heading north. The autumn landscape rolled endlessly ahead of him, golden fields, weathered fences, clusters of pine trees, and distant mountains whose peaks seemed to dissolve into the clouds. The two German Shepherd puppies sat side by side in the passenger seat. Neither was sleeping. Neither appeared uncertain. That was what continued to bother Walter. Animals got lost. Animals wandered. Animals chased smells and distractions. These puppies seemed to be following instructions. Every time Walter reached an intersection, one of them would stand, place its paws against the dashboard, and stare intensely in a specific direction. So far, every turn had been deliberate. By noon, they had already traveled farther than Walter expected. Several times he considered turning around. Several times he didn't. The strange thing about grief, Walter thought, was that it often disguised itself as routine. People assumed loneliness felt dramatic. In reality, it felt ordinary. It looked like eating dinner alone every night. It looked like ignoring phone calls. It looked like convincing yourself that isolation was a choice when it had slowly become a habit. For 3 years, Walter had lived inside that habit. Now, 2 muddy puppies were pulling him out of it, 1 mile at a time. The road eventually led them through a tiny farming community that barely deserved to be called a town. A handful of buildings stood beside the highway: a gas station, a feed store, a diner, and a church with peeling white paint. Walter stopped to refuel. The moment he opened the truck door, both puppies jumped out and stretched. They didn't run. They didn't explore. They waited beside the truck, watching him. A young woman standing outside the gas station noticed them immediately. "Beautiful dogs," she said. Walter turned. The woman appeared to be around 30 years old, tall and slender with dark brown hair tied into a loose ponytail. Her sun-tanned skin suggested long hours outdoors. She wore work boots, faded jeans, and a denim jacket stained with paint. Her name tag identified her as Emily. There was an easy confidence about her, the kind that came from people who spent more time solving problems than complaining about them. "Not mine," Walter said. The woman smiled. "They seem to think otherwise." Walter glanced down. The puppies had positioned themselves directly beside his legs, as though standing guard. For some reason, that made him uncomfortable. Not because he disliked it, because it felt good, and good things had become difficult to trust. The woman crouched to pet them. The puppies accepted the attention politely, but showed little interest. Instead, they kept looking toward the northern hills. Emily noticed. "That's odd." "What is?" "They keep checking the same direction." Walter folded his arms. "You're not helping." She laughed. "Sorry." A few minutes later, Walter climbed back into the truck. The puppies immediately resumed their watch. North. Always north. The journey continued. Hours passed. The landscape changed. The roads narrowed. Civilization became less frequent. Eventually, they reached an area filled with abandoned farms. Many of the properties had been deserted years earlier. Empty barns leaned against the wind. Broken tractors rusted beside collapsed fences. Nature had slowly begun reclaiming everything. Walter noticed something unexpected. The puppies seemed more alert here, more focused, as though they recognized parts of the route. Several times they became visibly excited near old dirt roads branching away from the highway. How could they know this area? The question lingered. Late that afternoon, Walter parked near an abandoned farmhouse to stretch his legs. The structure looked as though nobody had lived there for at least a decade. The roof sagged. The windows were broken. Tall weeds surrounded the porch. One puppy wandered toward the property. The other followed. Walter watched carefully. Instead of exploring randomly, they approached a particular section of fence near the rear pasture. Both dogs stopped, sniffed, waited, then moved on. Almost as if they were confirming they remained on the correct path. Walter felt another chill. Not fear, recognition. This wasn't wandering, this was navigation. The realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. As evening approached, he found himself thinking about Sarah again. His daughter had called yesterday. He still hadn't returned the call. That fact bothered him. Not enough to act on it, but enough to think about it. Walter remembered Sarah at 16, the first time she drove a car. The first time she brought home a boyfriend. The first time she told him he was impossible to talk to. Back then, he had dismissed her frustration. Later, after Eleanor died, those same complaints became impossible to ignore. People often imagined broken relationships as the result of one terrible moment. Walter knew better. Most relationships died from accumulated silence. One conversation avoided, then another, until years passed. Until strangers occupied places where family used to live. The puppies interrupted his thoughts. Both suddenly stood, alert, focused, excited. Walter followed their gaze. The sun was beginning to disappear behind the mountains. Far ahead, beyond a series of winding dirt roads, a familiar ridge appeared against the fading sky. Walter froze. He knew that ridge. Not from recent years, from 5 years ago. During the weeks Daisy had lived with him, he had occasionally driven her into the mountains for exercise after her injury healed. There had been one particular valley she loved, a hidden place far from towns and highways, a place few people visited. The memory returned so vividly that Walter could almost see Daisy running through the tall grass. The puppies began moving again, faster now, purposefully. Walter climbed back into the truck. For nearly another hour, they followed increasingly rough roads. The terrain grew steeper, the forests thicker. Cell phone service disappeared completely. Eventually, the road narrowed into little more than an overgrown trail. Walter stopped the truck. The puppies jumped out immediately. Neither hesitated, neither looked back. They simply continued forward. Walter followed on foot. The sun had nearly vanished when they emerged from the trees, and there it was, the valley, exactly as he remembered. A secluded stretch of open land surrounded by mountains and pine forest. For a moment, Walter could not speak. 5 years disappeared. The memories came rushing back. Daisy running through the grass, Eleanor laughing from the passenger seat. A version of his life that no longer existed. The puppies stood quietly at the edge of the valley, waiting, watching, as though they had finally reached the place they had been searching for all along. Walter stared across the fading landscape. A strange feeling settled over him. Not certainty, not understanding, just the unmistakable sense that whatever answer he was looking for was somewhere inside this valley. And for the first time since this journey began, Walter realized he was no longer trying to figure out where the puppies were leading him. He was trying to figure out why. The last light of day faded slowly across the valley as Walter Grayson stood at the edge of the open field, surrounded by memories he had spent years trying not to revisit. The mountains cast long shadows over the grasslands, and a cold breeze drifted down from the higher elevations. The 2 German Shepherd puppies remained several yards ahead, their attention fixed on something hidden beyond a cluster of pine trees. Neither puppy seemed interested in resting. Neither seemed interested in food. For the first time since the journey began, Walter noticed tension in their behavior. Urgency. The puppies exchanged glances, then moved forward. Walter followed. The farther they walked into the valley, the more familiar the landscape became. He recognized the narrow creek winding through the grass. He recognized a weathered fence post leaning sideways near an abandoned trail. 5 years earlier, he and Daisy had walked this area countless times while her injured leg healed. Back then, Daisy had run through the valley like she owned it. Now, an uneasy feeling settled inside Walter's chest. The puppies suddenly broke into a run. Walter's pulse quickened. They disappeared beyond a line of trees. "Hey!" he shouted. No response. He hurried after them as fast as his 72-year-old knees allowed. The forest opened into a clearing, and there it stood, an old barn. The structure looked as though it had survived decades of neglect. Half the roof had collapsed. Sections of the walls leaned dangerously inward. Rusted farm equipment lay scattered nearby beneath weeds and brush. The puppies were already inside. Walter approached cautiously. The barn door hung crooked from a single hinge. A faint sound drifted from the darkness within. Not barking, not movement. Breathing. Slow. Labored. Walter stepped inside. At first he couldn't see anything. Then his eyes adjusted, and everything stopped. Near the rear wall, resting on a bed of old hay, lay a German Shepherd, Daisy. The years had changed her. The powerful dog he remembered had become painfully thin. Gray fur spread across her muzzle and around her eyes. Her ribs were visible beneath her coat. One ear no longer stood upright. Age and hardship had left their marks everywhere. For several seconds, Walter could not move. His mind struggled to accept what his eyes already knew. Daisy. The name barely escaped his lips. The old dog slowly lifted her head. Her eyes found him immediately. Not confusion, not caution. Recognition. Instant recognition. Walter felt his throat tighten. 5 years, 5 entire years, and somehow she still knew him. The puppies rushed toward their mother. They pressed against her sides. One licked her face, the other curled against her shoulder. Daisy nudged both gently before looking back at Walter. The sight shattered something inside him. Human beings often convince themselves they understand loyalty, yet standing there, Walter realized most people barely understood it at all. He had spent years assuming Daisy had forgotten him, moved on, disappeared into another life. Instead, she had somehow survived alone and remembered. Walter slowly approached. Daisy never looked away. When he finally knelt beside her, the old dog extended her nose and touched his hand. A simple gesture, nothing dramatic. Yet Walter felt tears gathering in his eyes before he could stop them. "You stubborn girl." His voice cracked. The puppies settled beside their mother. For several minutes, nobody moved. The barn remained silent except for the wind outside. Eventually, Walter examined Daisy more carefully. The signs were impossible to ignore: severe weight loss, weak breathing, exhaustion, age. Whatever strength Daisy once possessed was fading. The realization hurt more than he expected, because finding her should have felt like a reunion. Instead, it felt like arriving at the end of something. As darkness settled outside, Walter searched the surrounding property. The remains of an old homestead stood nearby. Most of it had collapsed long ago. Still, traces of human life remained. A broken porch, an overturned water trough, a rusted pickup truck sinking into the earth. Inside one partially standing shed, Walter discovered several old supplies. Nothing recent, but enough clues to tell a story. Someone had once lived here. Someone had cared for Daisy. He found an old veterinary receipt tucked inside a metal box. The paper had faded badly. The owner's name was barely readable: Frank Mercer. Walter stared at it. The name sounded vaguely familiar. After several moments, he remembered. Frank Mercer had owned cattle in this region years ago. A quiet widower, friendly enough, kept mostly to himself. Walter had heard that Frank died several years earlier. No children, no remaining family. Nobody to take over the property. Nobody to care for the animals. Suddenly, the pieces began fitting together. Perhaps Daisy had eventually found her way here after leaving Walter. Perhaps Frank had taken her in. And when Frank died, Daisy had remained alone. The thought left a heavy ache in Walter's chest. People often imagined loneliness belonged only to humans. Looking around the abandoned property, Walter wasn't so sure. Night arrived quickly in the mountains. Walter carried blankets from the truck. He built a small fire ring outside the barn using fallen branches. The puppies stayed close to Daisy, never wandering far, never relaxing completely. Watching, waiting, as though they understood more than they should. Walter prepared a simple meal and sat beside the barn entrance. The stars slowly emerged overhead. For the first time in years, he found himself talking aloud, not because anyone was listening, because silence sometimes becomes too heavy to carry alone. He spoke about Eleanor, about Sarah, about the house he planned to sell, about the years he wasted hiding from grief. Daisy listened quietly, occasionally lifting her head, occasionally shifting closer. And somehow, that felt enough. Near midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. Walter spread another blanket across the hay. The puppies immediately settled against their mother. Daisy watched them for a long time. Then something unexpected happened. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself upright. Walter moved to help. The old dog ignored the assistance. With visible effort, Daisy crossed the short distance separating them. Then she lowered herself onto the blanket beside him, close enough that her side touched his leg. Walter froze. 5 years earlier, Daisy had slept beside Eleanor every night. Tonight, for the first time since disappearing, she chose to lie beside him again. Walter gently rested one hand on her shoulder. The old dog closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved softly through the valley. Inside the ruined barn, surrounded by darkness, memories, and two exhausted puppies, Walter sat awake for a long time, not wanting to waste a single moment. Because deep down, he already understood something his heart wasn't ready to admit. This reunion had arrived years late, but it had arrived just in time. And that night, for the first time in 5 years, Daisy slept beside Walter once more. A cold gray dawn crept across the valley as Walter Grayson opened his eyes inside the ruined barn. For a brief moment, he forgot where he was. Then he felt the familiar weight resting against his leg. Daisy. The old German shepherd was still lying beside him, still breathing, but only barely. The change from the night before was impossible to ignore. Her breathing had become shallow and uneven. Her chest rose slowly and fell even slower. The bright intelligence that had once filled her eyes remained, but her body no longer possessed the strength to support it. The two puppies sensed it too. Animals often understood things long before humans accepted them. Both puppies remained unusually quiet that morning. They rarely left their mother's side. Every movement seemed cautious, as though they feared disturbing something fragile. Walter knelt beside Daisy and gently ran his hand through the graying fur along her neck. "Let's get you some help." Daisy looked at him, not resisting, not agreeing, simply looking, the same way she always had. An hour later, Walter carefully lifted her into the truck, using a blanket as a stretcher. The puppies climbed into the back seat without being asked. The drive out of the valley felt longer than before, partly because the roads were rough, mostly because Walter already suspected how the day would end. Human beings often tell themselves they are seeking answers, when they are really searching for hope. Walter knew the difference, yet he drove anyway, because giving up felt worse. The nearest veterinary clinic sat on the outskirts of a small town nearly 40 miles away. The building was modest but well-maintained. Flower boxes rested beneath the windows, and a weathered wooden sign swung gently above the entrance. When Walter carried Daisy inside, a veterinary technician immediately came forward. Within minutes, they were escorted into an examination room. The veterinarian entered shortly afterward. Dr. Rebecca Lawson appeared to be in her early 60s, with short silver hair and calm brown eyes. Her posture carried quiet confidence rather than authority. Decades of caring for animals had softened her voice without weakening it. Walter liked her immediately. Not because she offered comfort, because she offered honesty. Dr. Lawson examined Daisy carefully. She listened to her heart, checked her breathing, reviewed her condition in silence. The examination lasted nearly 20 minutes. Walter already knew the answer before she finally spoke. "She's very old." Walter nodded. "I figured." Dr. Lawson sat down across from him. "There's significant heart failure, severe weight loss. Her body is shutting down." The words landed softly. That somehow made them hurt more. "Can you help her?" The veterinarian paused, not because she didn't know, because she respected the question. "We can make her comfortable." Walter stared at the floor. Comfortable. Such a small word, such a painful one. Because comfortable wasn't the same as saved. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Dr. Lawson leaned forward slightly. "I've been doing this for 33 years. Walter looked up. The veterinarian smiled sadly. The hardest lesson people learn is that love doesn't always mean fixing something. Walter swallowed. Outside the examination room, one puppy whimpered softly. The sound broke something inside him. After receiving medication to ease Daisy's discomfort, Walter made a decision. He wasn't taking her back to the clinic. He wasn't leaving her in a sterile room surrounded by strangers. Daisy had chosen the valley. Daisy had waited there. Daisy belonged there. So he drove her home, not to his house, to the small cabin near the old property that Frank Mercer had once used during calving season. The structure remained weathered but functional. A stone fireplace occupied one corner. Dust covered most surfaces. Yet it offered shelter and peace. Walter spent the afternoon cleaning. The puppies followed him everywhere, occasionally checking on Daisy before returning to watch him work. As evening settled across the mountains, a fire crackled inside the fireplace. Warm light filled the cabin. Daisy rested on a thick blanket near the hearth. The puppies curled against her sides. For the first time since finding her, Walter felt no urgency, only sadness. The quiet kind. The honest kind. His phone rang. The screen displayed Martha Reynolds. Walter almost ignored it out of habit. Then he answered. "Well," Martha said immediately, "you finally remembered phones exist." Walter surprised himself by laughing. The sound felt unfamiliar. Martha noticed. "I haven't heard that in years." Neither had Walter. For a few minutes they spoke about ordinary things, the weather, the drive, the puppies. Then the conversation shifted. Gradually, naturally, the way real conversations often do. Without warning, Walter found himself telling Martha things he hadn't said aloud in years. About Eleanor, about the empty house, about waking up every morning and wondering why he bothered making coffee for one person, about watching life continue for everyone else while his own seemed stuck in place. The words came easier than expected. Perhaps because Martha never interrupted. Perhaps because loneliness becomes lighter when someone finally acknowledges its weight. When Walter finished speaking, silence filled the line. Then Martha quietly said, "You've been carrying all of that alone." Walter stared into the fire. "Yeah. You don't have to." Simple words, yet somehow more difficult to hear than complicated ones. After the call ended, the cabin grew quiet again. Outside, darkness settled over the valley. Stars appeared one by one. Inside, the fire crackled softly. Walter sat beside Daisy for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes remembering, sometimes simply listening to her breathing. The puppies eventually fell asleep, one resting against her shoulder, the other curled near her hind legs. Walter watched them and thought about how strange life could be. 5 years ago he had rescued Daisy. Now Daisy had somehow led him back to herself. Not because she needed saving, because she needed someone present. The distinction mattered. Around midnight, Daisy slowly opened her eyes. Walter immediately leaned closer. The old dog looked at him, then at her puppies, then back at him. For a long moment, nobody moved. Walter gently placed his hand on her head. "You did good." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "You took care of them." Daisy closed her eyes again, satisfied. The night passed slowly, hour by hour, breath by breath. The mountains remained silent outside. Just before sunrise, pale light began appearing through the cabin windows. Walter had not slept. Neither had the puppies. Daisy's breathing grew softer, then softer still. Walter felt her head resting against his leg. He stroked the fur behind her ears, the same place she had always liked, the same place Eleanor used to scratch. The old dog exhaled one final time, peacefully, without struggle, without fear. Her head remained resting against Walter's leg. The sunrise slowly filled the cabin. The puppies stayed beside their mother, and Walter sat perfectly still. Because some goodbyes deserved silence. And at dawn, 5 years after disappearing from his life, Daisy passed away, with her head resting on Walter's leg. A soft autumn rain drifted across the valley 2 days after Daisy's death. Gray clouds hung low over the mountains, and the world seemed quieter than usual. Even the wind moved gently through the pine trees, as if the valley itself understood that something important had come to an end. Walter Grayson stood beside a freshly turned patch of earth beneath a large cottonwood tree overlooking the meadow. The grave was simple. Daisy would have preferred it that way. A small wooden marker rested at the head of the site. Nothing elaborate, nothing dramatic. Just her name carved carefully into the wood. Daisy. The 2 German shepherd puppies sat nearby. They had remained unusually calm since the burial. Not cheerful, not playful, but peaceful. That struck Walter as strange. When humans lose someone, they often spend months fighting reality. Animals seemed different. They grieved, certainly, yet they accepted what they could not change. Walter wished people were better at that. For several minutes he stood silently, staring at the grave. Then he found himself speaking aloud, not because he expected an answer, because grief sometimes demanded witnesses, even when the witness was gone. "You should have stayed angry at me," he said quietly. Rain collected along the brim of his hat. "You would have had every right." The puppies watched him. Walter smiled sadly. 5 years earlier, when Daisy disappeared, part of him had felt abandoned, not consciously, not rationally, but the feeling had existed. After Eleanor's death, abandonment had become a language his heart understood too well. Looking back now, he realized how unfair that thought had been. Daisy had never belonged to him. Saving someone didn't mean owning them. Human beings often confused gratitude with obligation. Walter had made that mistake without realizing it. Daisy had returned to her own life, built her own story, raised her own family. Yet somehow, she had never forgotten him. That realization felt larger than the loss itself. The rain stopped shortly after noon. Walter spent the afternoon cleaning the cabin near the old Mercer property. The puppies followed him everywhere. For the first time since their arrival, they no longer stared constantly toward the mountains. Their mission had ended. That fact carried unexpected weight. If Daisy had taught them to find Walter, then what came next? The question lingered. While clearing dust from an old bookshelf, Walter discovered a rusted metal box hidden behind several weathered journals. Curious, he opened it. Inside were old property records belonging to Frank Mercer, faded photographs of cattle drives, and several folded documents. One photograph immediately caught his attention. Frank Mercer stood beside Daisy. The picture appeared to be 4 or 5 years old. Frank looked exactly as Walter remembered him, tall, lean, deeply weathered by decades of ranch work. His face carried sharp lines carved by wind, sun, and hard labor. Thick white stubble covered his jaw. His expression seemed serious at first glance, though his eyes revealed a quiet kindness. Daisy stood beside him, healthy, strong, happy. Walter stared at the photograph for a long time. A strange comfort settled over him. Daisy had not spent those years alone. She had found another friend, another home, another chapter. Perhaps that was what life was supposed to be. Not a single story, many stories connected together. As evening approached, Walter returned to his truck and began sorting through items he had brought from home. One cardboard box contained paperwork he had ignored for months, bills, advertisements, medical statements, and one unopened envelope. The moment he saw the handwriting, his stomach tightened. Sarah. The envelope looked old, very old, at least 6 months. Walter immediately remembered placing it aside. He had told himself he would read it later. Later had become half a year. the same way one missed phone call had eventually become dozens. For several minutes, he simply stared at the envelope. Human beings rarely avoid things because they don't matter. Usually, they avoid them because they matter too much. Finally, he opened it. The letter inside was handwritten, several pages. Sarah's handwriting remained exactly as he remembered. Careful, neat, patient. The first lines immediately hurt, not because they were angry, because they weren't. Dear Dad, I don't know if you'll read this. Honestly, I don't know if you'll even open it. But I wanted to try one more time. Walter lowered the paper. His chest tightened. He continued reading. Sarah wrote about ordinary things, her work, her children, life in Spokane. Yet beneath every sentence rested a deeper truth. She missed him. Not the version of him from old photographs, the real him, the difficult him, the stubborn him. The father who no longer answered calls. The letter contained no accusations, no blame, only sadness. Toward the end, one paragraph stopped Walter completely. I know losing Mom changed everything. It changed me, too. But sometimes it feels like I lost both of you at the same time. Walter closed his eyes. Those words stayed with him for a long while, because they were true. After Eleanor died, he hadn't simply withdrawn from pain. He had withdrawn from everyone, including the people who still loved him, especially them. The puppies climbed onto the rug beside his chair. One rested its head against his knee. The simple gesture reminded him painfully of Daisy. Then another realization emerged. If Daisy had truly remembered him all these years, if Daisy had trusted him enough to send her puppies searching for him, then maybe he had spent too long believing he was someone worth leaving behind. Maybe that belief had been wrong. Outside, darkness slowly covered the valley. Inside the cabin, Walter picked up his phone. His thumb hovered above Sarah's number. He lowered it, picked it up again, lowered it again. Fear was a strange thing. People expected fear during combat, during emergencies, during danger. Yet some of the hardest acts of courage happened in quiet rooms with nobody watching. Calling his daughter felt harder than anything he had done in years. The phone remained in his hand. The puppies watched him, patiently, as though waiting for one final decision. Walter laughed softly. You sound like your mother. One puppy tilted its head. The other wagged its tail. Walter took a long breath. Then he pressed the call button. The phone began ringing. Once, twice, 3 times. Every ring seemed louder than the last. Finally, the line connected. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then a familiar voice answered. Dad? Walter closed his eyes. 5 years earlier, Daisy had trusted him enough to survive. Now, perhaps, it was time to trust someone else enough to return. Dad? Sarah repeated softly. And for the first time in years, Walter did not hang up. The first snowfall of the season arrived earlier than expected. By late November, a thin blanket of white covered the mountains surrounding Livingston. The cottonwood tree where Daisy rested stood bare against the pale sky, its branches reaching upward like dark lines drawn across a winter canvas. Walter Grayson stood on the porch of his house and watched snowflakes drift through the morning air. For once, the silence no longer felt empty. The 2 German Shepherd puppies had changed the rhythm of the house. The larger puppy had become more confident, constantly investigating corners of the property and carrying random objects into the kitchen. The smaller puppy remained more thoughtful, often sitting beside windows for long stretches while observing the world outside. Both had grown noticeably since arriving. Neither seemed interested in leaving. Walter sometimes wondered if they had finally decided this place was home, or perhaps they had simply finished the task their mother had given them. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text message. Sarah. Leaving Spokane now. Should be there around noon. Walter stared at the screen. A strange nervousness settled into his chest. He had survived combat deployments, hostile environments, life-threatening situations. Yet the thought of seeing his daughter again made his hands feel unsteady. Human beings were strange creatures. We often feared emotional honesty more than actual danger. The hours passed slowly. Walter cleaned the kitchen twice, then reorganized tools in the garage. Then checked the driveway every 10 minutes. By noon, a dark SUV finally turned onto the property. Walter's stomach tightened. The vehicle rolled to a stop. The driver's door opened. Sarah stepped out. For a moment, neither moved. 5 years. That was how long it had been since they had seen each other face to face. Sarah looked older than Walter remembered. Not old, just changed. Life had added new lines around her eyes. Responsibility had replaced youth. She remained tall and slender, with chestnut brown hair falling past her shoulders, and thoughtful brown eyes that revealed far more emotion than she usually allowed herself to express. Walter immediately saw Eleanor in her. That realization hurt and comforted him at the same time. Sarah approached slowly. Walter stepped forward. Neither hugged, neither cried, neither said anything dramatic. Instead, Sarah looked around the property, then back at him. You still haven't fixed the fence. Walter glanced toward the fence. No. You've been saying you'll fix it for 10 years. Some traditions are important. Sarah laughed, a small laugh, but genuine. The tension eased slightly, not disappeared, just softened. The puppies chose that moment to charge across the yard. Both ran directly toward Sarah. She barely had time to react before they surrounded her. Tails wagging, snow flying, excitement everywhere. Oh my goodness! Sarah knelt immediately. The puppies adored her. Within seconds, they were climbing into her lap. Walter watched quietly. Animals often made introductions easier than people did. The puppies had no interest in old arguments, no interest in old wounds. They only cared about who was standing in front of them now. Perhaps people should learn from that. The afternoon passed awkwardly at first. Conversation moved carefully around sensitive topics. Work, weather, the drive from Spokane. Safe subjects, familiar subjects. Yet both knew those weren't the reason for the visit. Eventually, Sarah noticed a photograph sitting near the fireplace. Walter and Eleanor, years younger, standing beside Daisy. Sarah picked it up. Daisy? Walter nodded. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours. He told her everything. Finding the puppies, the journey, the valley, the reunion, Daisy's final days. Sarah listened without interruption. Several times she smiled. Several times she wiped away tears she pretended weren't there. When Walter finished, silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable silence, reflective silence. Finally, Sarah spoke. Mom would have loved that. Walter stared into the fireplace. Yeah. She always said animals found people for a reason. Walter smiled. She said that about everyone. She wasn't wrong. The words lingered. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, years of distance slowly began shrinking. Not because somebody won an argument, not because somebody apologized perfectly. Life rarely worked that way. Healing happened through smaller things. Listening. Patience. Showing up. As evening approached, Sarah wandered into the kitchen. Walter followed. She opened the refrigerator, then looked at him. Dad? What? There are 3 jars of mustard. Walter frowned. They were on sale. You live alone. They were still on sale. Sarah shook her head. The puppies followed her around the kitchen, one carrying a sock, the other carrying a dish towel. The sight finally made Sarah laugh openly. The sound filled the room. Walter realized how long it had been since he'd heard laughter inside the house. Years. Far too many years. Later that evening, Sarah joined him on the porch. Snow covered the yard now. The puppies chased each other through the white drifts. For several minutes they simply watched. Then Sarah asked the question both had avoided. Are you still selling the house? Walter looked toward the mountains. A month ago, the answer would have been easy. The house felt too large, too empty, too painful. But things had changed. The rooms no longer felt abandoned. The future no longer felt finished. He thought about Daisy, about the puppies, about Martha, about the phone call, about the possibility that life still had something left to offer. No. Sarah turned toward him. No? Walter shook his head. I'm staying. For the first time that day, relief appeared openly on Sarah's face. Not excitement, relief, as though she had been carrying that fear for years. I think that's good. So do I. The sun disappeared behind the snowy hills. The temperature dropped. Neither moved. Eventually, Sarah spoke again. There's something else. Walter looked at her. The kids want to meet the puppies. Walter blinked. The kids? Your grandchildren. The word felt unfamiliar, not because he forgot they existed, because he had allowed too much time to pass. Sarah smiled softly. They ask about you, you know. Walter lowered his eyes. Guilt remained, but for the first time, hope stood beside it. Would it be okay if we came for Christmas? The question hung in the cold air. Walter looked toward the house, toward the puppies racing through the snow, toward the life he had nearly abandoned. Then he nodded. Yeah. A smile spread across Sarah's face, not a dramatic movie smile, a real one, the kind built slowly after years of disappointment. Then we'll be here. And for the first time in many winters, Christmas no longer felt like something Walter needed to survive. It felt like something worth waiting for. Another autumn arrived in Montana. Golden leaves drifted lazily across the Grayson property as sunlight spilled over the mountains surrounding Livingston. The air carried the familiar scent of pine trees and wood smoke. 1 year had passed since the day Walter Grayson stood beside Daisy's grave and wondered what he was supposed to do with the rest of his life. The answer, it turned out, had arrived 1 day at a time. The old house no longer felt empty. On most mornings, Walter woke to the sound of claws running across hardwood floors, laughter from visiting grandchildren, or Martha Reynolds arguing with someone about the proper way to bake an apple pie. Sometimes, all 3 happened at once. Walter had learned not to complain. The 2 German Shepherd puppies were puppies no longer. They had grown into magnificent adult dogs. The larger male had developed a broad chest, powerful shoulders, and the calm confidence often seen in working dogs. The smaller female retained her mother's intelligent eyes and thoughtful nature. Together, they had become local celebrities. Everyone in town knew their story, or at least part of it. The dogs spent their days roaming the property, accompanying Walter into town, and occasionally creating minor chaos whenever they discovered something they considered interesting. One unfortunate mail carrier had learned that lesson after losing a hat to an enthusiastic game of tug-of-war. The story remained popular months later. Walter sat on the porch one afternoon, watching the dogs race across the yard. A year earlier, he would have been sitting alone. That thought never completely left him. Gratitude had a strange way of growing from memories of loneliness. Human beings rarely appreciate warmth until they remember the cold. The screen door opened behind him. "You're thinking again?" Walter smiled. Only Martha would say that, as if it were a medical condition. The 77-year-old widow carried 2 cups of coffee. Her curly white hair remained as rebellious as ever, and her bright green eyes still seemed permanently amused by life. Over the past year, she had become something far more important than a neighbor. She had become family. Not through any grand declaration, simply through consistency, showing up, again and again. That was how most meaningful relationships were built. Martha handed him a cup. "You look happy." Walter stared into the yard. "I think I am." Martha nodded. "Took you long enough." Walter laughed. The sound came easily now. The dogs immediately looked toward the porch, then returned to their game. Martha settled into the chair beside him. "How's the fundraiser coming?" Walter glanced toward the old barn visible across the property. One of the biggest changes during the past year had begun there. Shortly after Daisy's death, Walter decided to create a small, local program dedicated to helping abandoned animals throughout the county. Nothing elaborate, nothing designed for publicity. Just practical help. Food, temporary shelter, veterinary assistance, transportation, whatever was needed. The program became known simply as the Daisy Fund. What began as a small project unexpectedly grew. Local businesses donated supplies. Veterinarians volunteered services. Retired residents offered foster homes. People wanted to help. Sometimes all they needed was a reason. "Better than expected," Walter said. Martha smiled. "That's because you finally stopped trying to do everything alone." That observation hit closer to the truth than Walter cared to admit. For years, he had treated independence like a badge of honor. Now he understood the difference between independence and isolation. One made people stronger, the other slowly made them disappear. Later that week, the house filled with visitors. Sarah arrived with her family. The driveway echoed with excited voices and slamming car doors. Walter stepped outside just in time to see 2 children sprinting across the yard. His grandchildren. Ethan, age 11, possessed the same stubborn determination Walter once saw in Sarah. Thick brown hair constantly fell into his eyes because he refused to sit still long enough for proper haircuts. His younger sister, Lily, age 8, inherited Eleanor's kindness. She had freckles across her nose, bright blue eyes, and an endless habit of asking questions about everything, especially animals. The German shepherds adored both children. Within minutes, the dogs were chasing them across the property. Laughter filled the air. Walter stood watching, not participating, simply observing. Sometimes happiness felt almost fragile after years without it, like something that might disappear if examined too closely. Sarah appeared beside him. "You know they're going to wear those dogs out." Walter watched the chaos unfolding across the yard. "Dogs seem happy enough." Sarah smiled. "So do you." Walter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the mountains, toward the life he nearly abandoned, toward the future he almost missed. "I am." The simplicity of the statement surprised him. No qualifications, no excuses, just truth. Months passed. The seasons slowly turned. Eventually, autumn returned once more. 1 year, an entire year. On a quiet afternoon, Walter walked alone toward the large maple tree near the edge of the property. The leaves glowed orange and gold above him. The 2 German shepherds followed closely behind, not because they were trained, because they wanted to. Beneath the tree stood a small stone marker, simple, modest. Daisy. Walter lowered himself onto a nearby bench. The dogs settled beside his feet. For several minutes, nobody moved. The world remained peaceful. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves overhead. Walter found himself reflecting on the strange chain of events that had changed everything. The puppies arriving at his door, the journey north, the valley, the reunion, the goodbye. At the time, he believed he had rescued 2 lost puppies. That seemed obvious, reasonable, even noble. Now he understood how incomplete that version of the story had been. The truth was far more complicated and far more beautiful. Because Daisy had not sent the puppies looking for a home. She had sent them looking for him. Not because she needed something, because she knew he did. The realization still amazed him. For years, Walter believed loneliness was simply the final chapter of his life, an unavoidable ending. Then, 2 muddy puppies appeared on his porch. Everything changed. Not overnight, not magically. Real healing rarely worked that way. It happened through small moments. A phone call answered. A conversation started. A friendship accepted. A family rebuilt. A dog remembered. Walter looked down at the 2 German shepherds resting beside him. One lifted its head. The other stretched lazily in the afternoon sun. A smile appeared on Walter's face. The kind that no longer felt borrowed, no longer felt temporary. Above him, autumn leaves drifted gently through the air, and sitting beneath the maple tree, beside Daisy's marker and the dogs she had trusted him to find, Walter finally understood something that had taken him a year to learn. He thought he had saved 2 lost puppies. But Daisy had sent them to save him from spending the rest of his life alone. Sometimes we pray for a miracle and expect something dramatic. But in everyday life, God's answers often arrive quietly. A phone call we almost ignore. A person we thought was gone forever. 2 tired puppies sitting on a porch. Walter believed he was rescuing abandoned animals, but the deeper truth was that he was the one being rescued. Many of us carry loneliness, regret, or old wounds for so long that they begin to feel normal. We convince ourselves that nobody notices and nothing will change. Yet this story reminds us that God can use the smallest things to guide us back toward hope, family, and purpose. Maybe the miracle was never that Daisy's puppies found Walter. Maybe the miracle was that Walter found his way back to the people who still loved him. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need a little encouragement today. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what lesson stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy stories like this, please subscribe to the channel. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and fill your home with peace, comfort, and hope in the days ahead.